Next. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to talk about some of the good work that the department has been doing in regards to colonial water bird management, so piping plovers and leaf terns here on Long Island. So we're going to go through the origin of the program, where it started from long before I was with the agency. I know there's some folks in the room here that were here when it did start. Survey methods, some of the data that we've been collecting with our cooperators over years. And then a little bit into the species that we survey for, management that we're currently conducting on our property as well as with cooperators, the challenges that we're facing, and where the program is going to be heading. So the origins of the program started back in 1982. The DEC conducted preliminary surveys actually focusing on leaf terns. And then in 83, the DEC with the Nature Conservancy, CTUC, and some other regional cooperators started to standardize survey methods and implement a island-wide survey for terns. And then they started to find piping plovers along with that when they were out there conducting surveys for terns. In 85, that was the first year that the department conducted a standardized survey for all of the 21 species that we currently survey for, which are colonial nesting water birds, such as long-legged waders, egrets, herons, and ibises. So this is a quick map of the island, obviously, and this was one of the first surveys done in 1983. You can see the survey was pretty much conducted around the whole island, and it's pretty interesting to look back at some of the old data and see when the dates were. These have shifted now due to standard survey methodology. So the surveys basically consist of a survey map that a cooperator will get. We have, this is Fire Island right here. This is Smith Point, Suffolk County Park property. You can see on the map we have dotted lines that indicate our survey area. So the cooperator would survey basically from dotted line to dotted line, and they would be recording the species that they're surveying for. We try to survey all suitable habitat during the survey window, and each species has a separate survey window. We'll also be coordinating with landowners to survey marsh islands. So this is Big Crow Island, Jones Inlet area, and this is would be a more of a marsh island looking for common terns, gulls, herons. Probably wouldn't find plovers or leaf terns on that site there. So some of our survey dates: gulls, cormorants, and wading birds. We survey those guys every 3 years. This is actually gull and heron year, and we survey them once between May 17th through the 31st of May, and that's conducted once every 3 years. That's always fun, going into a gull colony and having to count gull species. If anyone's ever walked on a gull island on a warm summer day, it's delightful. Yeah. We're also surveying for oyster catchers this year. Again, another species that we conduct surveys for every 3 years. We're finding that the oyster catcher numbers on Long Island have been fluctuating a little bit, but again, with a 3-year survey, we need to continue to collect survey information. We don't survey these guys for every year. And then we get into species that we survey every year. So these are our terns, commons, roseates, leaf terns, as well as black skimmers. So we'll do colony counts for those species. So all tern and skimmer colonies are surveyed twice. We survey them once between the 1st of June and then the 15th, and then we survey them one more time from the 15th to the end of the month, and then we take those numbers and they're averaged out, and that gives us our colony size for the year for the survey site. These are always fun. I like surveying for the tern species, especially when you have new seasonal staff on, because you send them into the colony and then you get to watch them get swooped on and whatnot, and then we count the birds from outside the colony. And then these are our piping plovers. As most of you guys know, one of our iconic coastal species down here in Long Island. We survey them every year, intensive management for our piping plovers down here. And we count every piping plover pair from the 1st of June to the 9th. Each site gets surveyed that has piping plovers on it every year. And then we compile that data and that information. It gets reported to the feds as part of our Atlantic Coast recovery goals in our recovery unit, which is New York and New Jersey combined. So productivity is collected for plovers as well. We'll monitor plover nests throughout the season, determine the fate of each of the individual eggs, hopefully, and at the end of the year, we'll have a pretty solid estimate on how many plover chicks fledged at a particular site during the breeding season. So with all that surveying being done, there's a copious amounts of data and data forms that are collected and submitted to the agency, and I have the great pleasure of going through them all. We collect data for plovers as part of our range in New York State, and then we're New York and New Jersey as our recovery unit, but it feeds into the bigger picture. The adult plovers, they'll lay up to 4 eggs. If the nest fails, they may re-nest again. Incubation lasts 25 to 30 days or so. And then the chicks are precocial, so they forage and feed as soon as they hatch. So good nesting next to close foraging habitat is important to these guys. And we're considering plover chicks fledged at 28 to 35 days, or even in some cases 25 days would we consider a plover chick fledged at. This is a map showing distribution of plovers across Long Island last breeding season. You can see the larger circles represent sites that have more plovers. Most of our nesting occurs on the South Shore of Long Island. We do have birds in the Peconics and up on the North Shore. These gaps that you see here, that's usually due to habitat issues. The birds don't like sites that have high bluffs in the background of them, so these North Shore sites are usually bluffed beaches or really susceptible to high tides. So our plover numbers over the course of the past 15 years or so, you can see they've dipped down a little bit. We're at 304 pairs last season. Our target goal for our recovery unit is 575 pairs sustainable for 5 years with a productivity of 1.5. So we've reached it in the past. It's dropped off, obviously, and we're hoping that this upward trend will continue, but we'll have to see. Productivity last season was pretty good. That's why I'm kind of confident that we're going to start to see a little increase in our pair numbers this year, just based on productivity. As you can see, it's kind of consistent with what the previous graph looked like in regards to pairs per year based on the previous year's productivity. This is our least tern. This is one of our smallest tern species that we have breeding on Long Island, identifiable by the white triangle on the forehead. These guys will nest out on the open sandy beaches. You'll find them with piping plovers as well. They're a colony nester. They have a very distinctive swooping, pooping defense, I guess you could say. As you get too close to the colony, they'll squawk at you and they may defecate onto you. But their chicks are altricial. They get fed by the adults. The least tern numbers have fluctuated over years. As you can see, we've had a little bit of an up year from 2014 to 2015. But the numbers kind of bounce around a lot. We've noticed that for some of our sites, we'll have, they're really susceptible to predation. If a predator gets into a site one season, you may not have birds back there for a few years until the colony starts to reestablish it. So we've toyed around with the idea of using decoys to reestablish birds at sites. We need to look into doing a little bit more work of that at some of our sites on the North Shore. Common terns, these are a little bit larger, identifiable by the black cap on top of the head and the orange beak. They're mostly some of our marsh island nesters. Again, they're a colony nester, similar defense mechanism to least terns where they have a swooping defense. And their chicks as well are altricial as well. Their numbers have jumped around. As you can see, this is a data issue, not an actual issue. But their numbers have kind of moved around a little bit, but nothing too worrisome in regards for us in New York State for common terns. A loss of habitat is one of the big things that these guys face. We'll see issues with nests flooding out due to high tides and storm events. And then roseate terns, I know Helen is supposed to be presenting later today, so I'm not going to say too much about them because she knows all about roseate terns. I don't want to say something wrong. But these guys are one of our larger terns as well. They're colony nesters. They like heavy vegetation. Some of our sites that we do have roseate terns at, I'll always direct staff to keep an eye on the bushes, keep an eye on the abandoned tire or the bow of the abandoned boat or something along those lines that's on the site. And if you see something fly in there, let's go back in there and check that site again. Let's see if there's a roseater. And that's 9 times out of 10, that's usually where the roseates nest. They like to get down in that heavier brush, that good cover and stuff like that. Great Gull Island is really the big driving site for our population in New York State. Their numbers have been looking pretty good for the most part. And again, like I said, Great Gull Island is really where we have all of our common terns. So switching over to some of the species that we'll be surveying this year, these are our gull and heron species, oyster catchers, cormorants, ibises, egrets, and whatnot. These guys are surveyed once every 3 years. This is one of our gull and heron years. This is always a year with a lot of work for us in our office, as well as a lot of work for our cooperators that needs to get done. The colonies are mapped and new ones are added. It's amazing where some of these birds will show up. We've had them in Region 2, so the Queens area, nesting in trees inside like the projects. We've had them along the Nesquequog River over multi-million-dollar homes. You know, we've had them on rock islands in the town of Babylon. So colony nesters, so especially cormorants, they always amaze me where they show up. So we're constantly looking for new sites and adding them into the survey matrix each year that they're scheduled to be done. So we're going to glance through these guys pretty quick. I don't want to bore you guys with a bunch of graphs and numbers, but oyster catchers, they're solitary beach nesters. We don't do any current active management for them, so no string fencing, no exclosures, none of that stuff, but they do benefit from the management that we do for our other species, our plovers and our tern species. There has been some discussion amongst cooperators about competition between oyster catchers and plovers. If you ask some folks, they'll say it's non-existent. If you ask some other folks, they're ready to go out there with a .22 and start shooting oyster catchers. So obviously we can't do that, but there's definitely a negative interaction, you know, habitat issues and stuff like that, requirements. We've seen oyster catchers destroy plover nests. We've seen oyster catchers chase plover adults off, you know, when they're foraging and feeding time is diminished when they have to run around chasing each other. So unfortunately, they don't necessarily go well together. Cormorants, ibises, our cormorant numbers have fluctuated a lot. Again, these are surveyed once every 3 years, so this year will be nice. We'll get another data point in there, and we'll try to figure out what's going on with these guys. Ibises are interesting. These guys nest mostly on our marsh islands, and they can be a little hard to survey for. They're usually the first guys in. When we get to a site, they're the first ones to fly out. They're in the thicker habitat, and when we go in and we do our surveys to these marsh islands, they'll fly up and they'll fly away. They'll actually leave the site when we survey for ibises. So it's kind of difficult for us to sometimes get a good count on our glossy ibis numbers. And then we get into some of our egret species, snow egrets and cattle egrets. Cattle egrets have pretty much been non-existent in the last couple survey windows. We had maybe 1 or 2 sites that someone said they saw a pair of cattle egrets. Not really confident on that one, but again, it's just kind of interesting that we have seen them in years past at certain sites, and maybe it'll be different this year as animals start to expand ranges or contract ranges to see what happens with cattle egrets this year. Our heron species, we got a few different heron species that nest around the island. As you can see, we can see lots of fluctuations. When you have low numbers, you know, you'll get these spikes and valleys in there for like green herons, for example. This, I believe, was all from about maybe 3 different sites. This changed in 1 year. So we'll see what happens in this year. I believe this was, the site had an infestation of a beetle, I think. Actually, I don't know. John probably had something to do with it. They cut a bunch of trees down, and that's the reason why this was in a Region 2 site. I can't remember the name of the island that they were on, but I believe there was a Region 2 site that had green herons at, and they went in and they cut all the trees down, and the herons had nowhere to nest, and I think they actually ended up going to New Jersey. But you know, who would go to New Jersey from New York, right? So our gull species are on the docket to get surveyed this year, which is great. They're colony nesters. The interesting thing that amazes me about the gulls is this one right here, the laughing gulls. It's crazy to see how much they've increased in our region over the past few years. We're starting to see them further and further east on the island. We used to always see them in the city area by the airports and whatnot, in the parking lots, and you know, at Shea Stadium and stuff like that. And now here they are showing up breeding out here on Long Island. So it'll be interesting to see where we find laughing gulls this survey year at some of our our marsh islands and some of our Gull Island sites. And then management. So management for our colonial nesters or our plovers and terns is really what we're going to talk about now. Management's been going on for a very long time. So there's a lot of folks in this room that have probably been involved in some level of plover management at some point in time in their career. String fencing, surveying, monitoring on the beach and stuff like that, working with landowners. So what we'll do is we'll work with a cooperator to determine where plovers or terns are nesting, and then we'll go out pre-season and we'll set up symbolic string fencing, which is nothing more than 6-foot U-posts with string ran between it with flagging just as a visual cue. Nothing to stop predators, nothing to stop people from walking in there, but again, it's a delineation of space that we're telling the general public, hey, don't walk in this area. It's restricted. There's plovers or terns nesting in the area. Some of the other things that we'll work on, now this is a video, and I'm going to blame Tim on this one for it not working. So we have sound, but there's no video. Oh, there it goes. And so this was sped up to show the building of an exclosure. So we're going to scroll through it because it's not buffering correctly here. This is a piping plover exclosure that we'll use. This is basically turkey wire that we'll erect around an exclosure, around a nest. The nest is 4 eggs at the time, or 3 eggs. The desire for the bird to incubate the nest is strong enough that we can go in and we can put this metal cage around the nest and protect the nest from avian or mammalian predators. We put a mesh on top of it. That's what the guys are doing right now. And the thought process is that the birds will be able to walk in and out of it freely, but the cat, the fox, the crow won't be able to get in there and predate the eggs. We find that it has been very successful in getting eggs to hatch. The problem that we're having as managers is once the eggs hatch, protecting the chicks. So there's been a good discussion as to where we're moving forward with management for plovers in that regards. So when we put up the exclosure, the nest is obviously located. We know where the nest is. Someone is responsible for keeping track of the bird at all times. We'll start a clock. We have a few minutes to get the exclosures in. And as we start to walk in, you can see in this video, you'll see the plover will actually come off the nest. We'll look at the clock and we'll say, okay, the time has started on it. And then the idea is to get the exclosure put in, buried down in the ground, and backfilled and leveled in the shortest amount of time possible. Most of my staff, I've been lucky enough to have staff on for a number of years now. We can do an exclosure in about 8 minutes or so on a nice sandy beach like this. This is actually up in Smithtown on the North Shore. You can see the plover there. It's doing a broken wing display. That's one of its defense mechanisms. We'll basically put the exclosure down. We'll mark it out. We'll then dig a hole. The exclosure goes down about 1 foot or so into the ground. And then the idea is to backfill it so that it's on grade, so the bird can walk in and out without any problems. The diameter of the holes there on the exclosure, it's 2 by 4. 2 inches wide by 4 inches high, so the plovers have no problem walking in and out. You can see, if you keep your eye on the corner over here, the bird running in and out, peeping the whole time. It's actually kind of exciting, if you like disturbing wildlife, I guess. Who doesn't? Let's be honest about it. We have, so this is, we shifted sites here because we have really good video, really good GoPro video of plover walking into exclosure. So you can see the birds right here. And it's so funny. So you're all excited to get this exclosure in. You really worked really hard to dig this down. You're all sweating. You're backed off. You're all the way over there. You're watching this bird. And it never fails. Anyone who's done an exclosure will tell you, the first thing that the birds will do will walk out to it and they'll start foraging and feeding. So you've turned all the soil over, so they're in there and they're like, hey, look, free meal. And all you want to do is stop the clock, because every minute the bird's off the nest, the eggs are exposed. So we want to get the bird back on the nest as quickly as possible. And the first thing the birds will do, you see he's eating over here. They'll run in and they'll start foraging and feeding. But you can see the bird walks in, no problem, sits down, and starts incubating the nest again. So that exclosure right there is going to help protect that bird, that egg, from any type of mammalian or avian predator that may want to try to predate on the eggs. Part of the other facet of the work that we try to do is interaction with the public, going to meetings, talking with user groups, special interest groups, working with landowners, interacting with the public when we're out on the beach. We also try to develop interpretive signage to put up. Audubon had a really good project a few years back called Be a Good Egg, where they used children artwork to try to convey the message of plover protection and coastal ecosystem protection. So when you're dealing with this and the bird's trying to nest in it, trying to get these people to understand that it's okay to protect this little area over here. You guys can all go recreate over there. So some of the challenges that we deal with is obviously, yes, unfortunately we can't trap them, but what are you gonna do? Good habitat in close proximity to good foraging habitat, minus the trucks. So we have our normal predators that predate on our ground nesting birds, our feral cats, our foxes, raccoons and crows. Yes, some of them are more native than others, but we are definitely well aware that there is a predator-prey relationship, and unfortunately we're making a conscious decision to manage for one species over another. And then human interferences. How do we get the guy in the Jeep to not drive on the beach? So working with property owners, working with special interest groups like the Beach Buggy Association and stuff like that to close areas off. And it's also challenging is when the landowners themselves have different mission statements than what, say, the department or what the Fish and Wildlife Service may have in mind. And then things like garbage and just making sure that we have places for folks to recreate. And then you have some of the other factors that are a little bit bigger. And I think some of the things that folks maybe don't necessarily would consider to be a threat to plovers, but shoreline hardening, establishment of bulkheading, protecting roads, protecting infrastructure, all important things. We're not saying they're not important, but definitely impact the ability of the natural processes to occur that the plovers accelerate in. Beach renourishment projects, dredging projects and whatnot, and even something as simple as dune plantings. So plovers like overwashed habitat. They like that early disturbed beach habitat, and you go in there and you put a dune in and you plant beach grass on it 12 on center. It definitely accelerates that vegetative process that the birds don't necessarily do well in. So some of the things that we'll be working on for the future of the Colonial Water Bird Program for the agency. Yes, we will be installing these at the entrance to Smith Point next week. So the additional listing of species, the red knot, as probably most of these folks know, was listed. Are we going to be doing management in the region for them? What kind of surveys are going to be conducted? Black skimmer management plan just came out. Some of the work that the folks in Region 2 are putting together to do work with black skimmers. We have some black skimmer colonies in the region. What is our involvement going to be in that regards? And taking advantage of new technology, remote sampling, the ability to use, drone technology, satellite technology, remote sampling techniques and stuff like that, working within the guidance of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the FAA. Just got an email the other day that they want to send some folks to some training to learn how to fly these things commercially so that we could potentially see about using them for colony counting, And then alternate nesting areas, colony reestablishment work, recreation of marsh islands using barges, and they've done it in Massachusetts where they've used gravel barges to create nesting habitat for terns that were displaced. Floating vegetative mats placed on low-lying marsh islands where we've had low productivity for some of our common tern species. Some of those things that are kicking around the office and potentially maybe in the works in the future years for our agency. And then the program as a whole, I've had the great pleasure of being involved with it for about 9 years now, and we couldn't do it without these guys. Our cooperators, the individuals that we give the data sheets to, that we send them out to, the folks like Helen Hayes and the work that she does at Great Gull Island, the folks over at the Nature Conservancy and all the different townships and stuff like that, all the work that they do to get the data to us so that we can compile it and then make a big muck of it and regurgitate it back to you guys. We wouldn't get done. To have folks like Suffolk County Parks involved with mission statements to provide recreational opportunities to tell folks that want to drive their trucks and go fishing that they can't do it because they need to protect a bird. it's a great thing. So, you know, without these folks, we wouldn't really have much of a leg to stand on. And then I want to thank all the people I stole photos from. And then obviously, this is all my contact information, so thanks.
Okay, we have a lot of time for questions, if you'll use the mics.
My name is Daniel Carpin. For the last 10 years, I've been going down to Fire Island on a fairly regular basis. 10 years ago, virtually no laughing gulls at Field 5, and now they're very abundant there.
Yeah.
They're amazingly come back really quite well.
Yeah, we, like I was saying in that slide, you know, the laughing gull colonies, the breeding colonies for laughing gulls, it'll be interesting to see where they pop up when we do an official survey this year, a census survey for them.
And you didn't have any notes about the ring-billed gulls that are very common all over the place. Do you count those?
Yeah, we count them as well. They're in there.
I didn't see the slide because I saw the great blackbacks and the herring gull counts, but no ring-bills counts.
Yeah, I can double check that, but yeah, I don't.
Hi, Chip.
Hey.
I have a resource allocation question. So it was my experience that the plovers, sometimes a nest will get monitored weekly, which is pretty different from the frequency of some of those other birds that are monitored once every 3 years. And so do you think the frequency of the plover monitoring is really giving you more valuable data, or do you think we could possibly reallocate some of those resources to get more frequent data on some of the other birds?
Well, that's a good question, and there's a couple of things that go into it. Where'd you go? Oh, there you are. You sat down. There's a couple of things that go into it. One, plovers are listed, so they're a federally protected species that we have a regulatory obligation to monitor and manage for. Greater blackback gulls, Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That's it. We have no reason to monitor for them. They're not threatened. They're not endangered. They're not on any of those listed other than NBTA. So that's the government answer for you right there. In regards for the science behind it, yeah, sure. If you go out and you survey on a more frequent basis a species, you're going to collect better information. One thing that we've always conveyed in our training is over-monitoring. And the fact that if you're not coordinating with the individuals that are working at a site and making sure that you know when the last time someone was there, you can be actually causing more harm by every time going to that nest, every time going to that site and disturbing that bird. So for our staff, what we do is we have a board in our field office that has all of our sites listed on it, and we write dates on it. Every time we were at a site, at the end of the day, we come back and we write the dates on it. And after about maybe 2 weeks or so, we kind of have a really good handle as to the rotation. And we can either pull sites from that, depending on the number of birds that are present and stuff like that. But yeah, if you go and you survey a species once every 3 years, then you know you're waiting 3 years. You're going to miss some of those trend numbers for sure. Whereas if you're visiting the site once, twice, 3 times a week, you're going to get better information. So yeah, I think that if there was a burning desire for us to manage for a species more, yeah, you could potentially pull some staff from monitoring plovers to focus on monitoring something else.
Thank you.
To the center.
Hey, Chip.
Hey.
In quick glance of your graphs of the plover and tern numbers, it appeared that the numbers may have kind of had a cyclical pattern. I was curious if in analyzing the raw data that's actually what you saw, and if you have any idea what might be causing those seemingly cyclical dips and rises in numbers.
Yeah, you know, some of the conversations that I've had with other folks that do plover management in our Atlantic recovery unit and whatnot, I wouldn't be surprised if you started to take a look at tide events and weather events, that there wouldn't be some type of correlation between the two. This is a species that nests in a very dynamic ecosystem. So throw the right wind and the right moon cycle and the right tide cycle out there, you lose basically a good chunk of nests that are on the foredune. You know, very similar to terns, and we'll see it where you'll go one day for the first survey, you'll have a moon tide, come in the next survey and half the colony is gone because the whole thing flooded out. I've never personally looked at that data, comparing it to weather information, but I have a pretty strong thought that that's probably what you're seeing there. And also there's about a 3-year lag when you get good productivity, so like what we had last season, to when you start to get that recruitment back into the breeding system. And there's also been good banding information. Virginia Tech's doing some good work right now that shows that you don't get, birds that are bred here are gonna breed here. If they're from Long Island and New York, they're gonna stay in Long Island and New York. So what we produce is what we get. So we're not getting birds that are bred in Connecticut and New Jersey coming in and nesting on Fire Island. So, but yeah, that's, sounds like a master's project to me.
Hi, Chip.
Hi.
I noticed in your aerial of your plover survey from Smith Point to Merich's Inlet, you could see the washover areas from Hurricane Sandy.
Yeah.
Have you seen any impacts on the nesting birds over there? Or not?
That's a tough question. There's a lot of stuff that's going on at that site in particular. So let's take it out of Smith Point and let's talk about it in generalities, because I don't want to offend anybody that may be in this room or not. So when you do have a washover event, we can go back in time to like the village of West Hampton Dunes and the creation of Pikes, a site that you're very familiar with. After Pikes was created in that washover event and that blowout, you had a large number of terns that came in and populated that site. There is no doubt that plovers do better in that early successional beach system where you have dune blowouts, where you have low-lying, moist soil adjacent to a little higher nesting area. I mean, the chicks, when they hatch, I mean, they're little cotton balls of legs, and they have to forage and feed within, the first few hours of them being out of the egg. So having that close proximity of good nesting habitat to good foraging habitat is important. But unfortunately, those blowouts, those dunes, the first thing that everyone wants to do is reestablish a dune, protect the mainland, revegetate it, that type of stuff. So it's hard to balance the protection of infrastructure, but yet still providing good nesting habitat that the plovers really enjoy. So hopefully I sidestepped that question just enough.
We do terrapin turtle counting and sometimes protection if we see them laying the nests. And we had issues at West Meadow Beach with people the first years when the cages were above and visual, people disturbing the nest because the terrapin eggs are valuable in some cultures. Do you find the cages over the plover nest to be attractive nuisances at all, or have people been respectful?
We have in the past had vandalism of plover nests, for sure. Like I said, I've been doing this for a long time, and I get the great pleasure of dealing with lots of people from all the way from like Queens all the way out to Montauk. So we've had stories from our urban park rangers of them going back to a site after a nest being exclosed and there being golf balls in place of the eggs. We've had full-fledged people just walk out and just trample the exclosure down and crush the eggs. Just last year, we had a site, and it saddens me. We had a site where a cooperator was doing the right thing, putting up an exclosure. The landowner, because I was on private property, was not happy about it. Long story short, they involved a child. There were small footprints in the exclosure. Law enforcement was called in. Federal investigation folks were called in. They made a lot of contacts and whatnot. And it was very obvious that an adult picked the kid up and put him in the exclosure, grabbed the eggs, took the kid out. And then when, unfortunately, the way the laws are written is you can't try somebody based on some footprints. They need to have evidence to say it, and also you're not going to write a ticket to a 6-year-old, but, they showed up to these people's houses in the city. I mean, this is their summer home to them. So working with our cooperators, collecting really, this is something that we teach in our plover training, how to document evidence, having really good photos of these things and knowing, visiting the site on a more frequent basis, understanding the dynamic of the site and the individuals that you're working with, you would make that conscious decision as to whether or not to even exclose a nest. So, so yeah, we have had negative interactions with the general public and the placement of exclosures. More so, it's the predatory impacts. Foxes are really smart. And when I worked for Suffolk County Parks, we put up exclosures, and in one night, fox took out like 7 exclosures. So that following that renest, so the birds will renest again, we didn't exclose. And we were thankful enough that the fox wasn't unable to find them. But yeah, once you put that cage over it, you're basically saying, hey, here it is. Any camouflage is out the window.
Is there any signage on the cage, or?
Oh, well, it's behind the string fencing, obviously. But no, we wouldn't want to put restricted area signs or anything along those lines on the cage itself. We want to try to have the plover sitting in this thing. So we try to make sure that it's nice, it's tight, the top is tight, it's not flapping in the wind. It's going to withstand that, that beach environment. So any type of material on there that could cause it to shake around, we don't want it.
Wonderful.
We don't want it on there.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
One last question.
Yeah, hi. If you could just clarify, the exclosures are a net positive, though, right?
Yeah. So we wouldn't we wouldn't put exclosures over them if all the plovers died. That's just obviously But yeah, it's the goal is protect the eggs to the point where they hatch, and then hopefully the adults will be able to protect the chicks. So the exclosure doesn't keep the birds in there. They can go move freely in and out of it and whatnot. The goal is to protect the nest from avian and mammalian predators. And we don't just use exclosures at every site, where there's a conscious decision that's made as to whether or not we're going to exclose a site. So if we see a site that we don't have any or haven't had any mammalian predation for a few years, or avian predation, and we're not losing nests, we're getting good hatching rates, even decent productivity, we're not going to exclose. One, it's staff time and effort. Two, it's an attractive nuisance, for someone that may be walking by, and it's a big disruption to the natural processes of the plover moving in and around the nest. We don't want to go in there and disturb that bird for 15, 20 minutes by putting up an exclosure unless we have to.
My real question is, have you tested the water quality at all at any of the beaches where they nest? And if so, have you noticed any effects that water quality might have?
Yeah, so there was some research done by Jonathan Cohen a few years back out of Virginia Tech using not necessarily water quality, but more so the prey source that the birds are feeding on, the invertebrates in the soil and whatnot, trying to collect information from that by using basically sticky traps. And I think that would be a better correlation than necessarily water quality. You're looking at that high energy intertidal area, the rack line material that's coming up. That's where these birds are foraging and feeding in the most part, that soft, sandy, marshy habitat and stuff like that. So figuring out what makes a site attractive to a plover, there's been a lot of research done on that, and that prey source is really what I think can be a contributing factor. I think that the reason why we have low productivity at certain sites is not necessarily that the sites are not biologically conducive to the birds nesting there, as more as it is that large predator on the beach chair disrupting the birds every time they walk down the beach. And then, the dog walkers, the recreators, it's that time, the ability of the bird that's, this big, that tall, to spend at the intertidal zone foraging and feeding. I think that that's the big driving factor as to why certain sites have lower productivity than other sites.
So to follow up, do you have a sense that they might actually be doing better at places with massive algal blooms that people won't spend that much time at?
No, I don't have that sense at all.
Okay.
No, I think that it's in certain places, not in New York State, on lands that these birds are, on federal lands in particular, they close the beach. They shut the door. Sorry, the beach is closed today. You can't come out here until the plovers are gone. and they have really good productivity at those sites. So that lack of human interaction, that lack of disturbance for the bird, to me equates to time spent doing what they do, which is, you know, sheltering, foraging, feeding, relaxing. It's all about conservation of energy, right, when it's all said and done. So you've got this little plover that needs to get all of its moisture, all of its resources from invertebrates, from material it's finding on the beachfront. So getting that bird to spend its time and effort just focusing on foraging and feeding and dealing with avoiding natural predators is the key. So we can remove natural predators to some extent, but really what we need to do is we need to prevent us, people, humans, from being on the beachfront in certain areas. So the town of Hempstead, for example, they have really good hatch success, but in most cases they have really poor productivity. And it's because the chicks are just, every time we get chicks in, they're emaciated, they're dehydrated. You know, that's what we get back from our pathology lab. And that to me equates to stress and not enough time spent feeding.
Great. Thank you.
Okay,
Yep.
we're out of time. Thank you, Chip.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, everybody.